Paper ripping shouldn't sound like a gunshot, but when Officer Gage Harlan tore the thick wax seal from a brown envelope handed to him by a quiet woman in a rusted Honda, he might as well have pulled the trigger. He believed he was dealing with a frightened, low-level civilian trying to pull a sovereign citizen stunt. I had no idea. The document he had just destroyed belonged to the United States Department of Justice. Not long after, 15 armored SUVs would barricade his precinct, and Gage would finally understand he was no longer the predator. He had become the prey. The humidity across the greater Philadelphia area had been thick enough to choke on all week, turning the night air into a damp, suffocating blanket. Gage drummed his thick fingers against the steering wheel, jaw locked in a permanent scowl. He hated the night shift. He hated the empty stretch of Route 9. Most of all, he hated the quiet knowledge that his career had stalled in a forgotten corner of the city, ignored by the political elite. Ahead of him, a faded silver Honda Civic drifted slightly over the yellow line before correcting. Its passenger side taillight was shattered, throwing a harsh white glare instead of the required red. For Gage, it was the perfect excuse. He didn't care about traffic safety. He cared about the power trip, the only thing that made the graveyard shift bearable. He flipped the switch. The light bar erupted in a blinding frenzy of red and blue, washing the cracked asphalt and dead trees in strobing neon. The Honda's brake lights flared at once. The driver never tried to run, never hesitated. She simply pulled onto the gravel shoulder, tires crunching loud in the still night. Gage shifted into park, unclipped his seatbelt, and adjusted the heavy leather gun belt on his hips. He took his time stepping out, letting the anxiety build inside the other vehicle. Classic intimidation. He walked with a heavy, deliberate swagger, hand resting casually on the butt of his service weapon, flashlight held high and aimed at the driver's side mirror to blind whoever sat inside. When he reached the window, it was already down. He shone the powerful mag light straight into the driver's face, expecting the usual squinting, raised hands, nervous stammering. Instead, he met a gaze as cold and unyielding as polished black glass. The woman behind the wheel was black, appearing to be in her late 30s. Despite the sweltering heat and the battered condition of the Honda, she wore a tailored charcoal gray blazer over a crisp white blouse. Not a single bead of sweat touched her forehead. Her posture was rigidly straight, hands resting at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, completely still. "License, registration, and proof of insurance," Gage barked, voice thick with the abrasive tone he reserved for people he considered beneath him. "You were swerving back there, and your taillight is out." She did not blink against the glare. "I wasn't swerving, officer," she said. Her voice was low, measured, and terrifyingly calm. Not the defensive tone of someone caught in a lie, but the quiet correction of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. "And my taillight was broken while the vehicle was parked outside a municipal building earlier this evening. I filed a report." "I didn't ask for your life story," Gage snapped, stepping closer, his bulk looming over the door. "I asked for your documents. Hand them over, now." Slowly, deliberately, she moved her right hand. She did not reach for the glove box or a purse. She reached into the inside pocket of her blazer. Gage's muscles tensed. His hand instinctively gripped his holster. "Keep your hands where I can see them," he yelled. She paused, looking at him with an expression that bordered on pity. Then, using only thumb and index finger, she drew out a heavy brown legal-sized envelope and held it through the open window. Gage snatched it. He shone his light across the surface. It was not a registration card. It was not an insurance card. It was thick, high-grade parchment. Across the front, stamped in bold blood-red ink, were the words, "United States Department of Justice, sealed by order of the federal court. Do not open or tamper under penalty of 18 U.S.C. Chapter 1599. The back was sealed with heavy crimson wax bearing the federal eagle crest. Gage let out a harsh, barking laugh. He looked back at the woman, a sneer twisting his face. "What is this garbage? You one of those sovereign citizen nuts? You think handing me a fake piece of paper with some fancy red wax gets you out of a ticket?" "Officer," the woman said, her voice dropping an octave, carrying sudden crushing weight, "I strongly advise you to read the exterior of that document very carefully. I am not required to provide standard civilian documentation, and you are not authorized to open that envelope. Return it to me. Step back to your vehicle. Call your precinct captain. "You don't give me orders," Gage hissed, face flushing dark red. The sheer audacity of this woman sitting in a junk car giving him commands made his blood boil. Out here, he was the law. "I'm going to ask you one last time for your driver's license, or I'm pulling you out of this car and putting you in cuffs." "That envelope is my identification and my authorization," she replied softly. "Do not break that seal." The warning only fed his ego. In a brazen display of defiance and anger, he dug his thick thumb under the wax. "Let's see what kind of sovereign citizen manifesto you've got in here," he mocked. With a loud, sickening rip, Gage tore the heavy paper, snapping the wax seal in half and ripping the envelope open. He pulled out a thick stack of documents, completely ignoring the watermarked federal paper. He skimmed the first page, eyes barely registering the complex legal language, the federal court seals, the signature of a United States district judge. The woman watched him. Her expression did not shift to panic. It shifted to finality. "Officer Harlan," she said quietly, reading his name tag, "you just committed a federal felony, destruction of a sealed federal warrant, and obstruction of a federal investigation." Gage stopped. He looked at the torn envelope, then back at her. His ego refused to yield. "Step out of the car," he growled, dropping the documents onto the roof of the Honda. "You're under arrest." "On what charge?" she asked, not moving. "Failure to provide identification, resisting a lawful order, and producing forged legal documents." He spat. He yanked open her door and grabbed her arm roughly. She did not fight. She allowed herself to be pulled from the car, turned, and pressed against the cold metal. As Gage forced her arms behind her back and clamped the cold steel handcuffs tight around her wrists, she never flinched. "You have no idea what you've just initiated," she whispered, voice barely carrying over the hum of the cruiser's engine. "Save it for the judge," Gage mocked, marching her toward the rear of his cruiser. He grabbed the torn papers from the roof, crumpled them slightly, and shoved her into the back seat. As he slammed the door, a surge of triumphant adrenaline washed through him. He had put another arrogant citizen in her place. He never noticed the tiny flashing green light on the lapel pin of her blazer, transmitting a silent, encrypted signal straight to a satellite and on to a heavily fortified command center miles away. The 8th District Precinct was a crumbling brick fortress that smelled permanently of stale burnt coffee, industrial floor wax, and quiet despair. It was the kind of station where careers went to die, staffed by officers either too close to retirement to care or too deeply rooted in the local grit to ever leave. Gage marched the handcuffed woman through the heavy double doors, parading her past the holding cells with his chest puffed out. Desk Sergeant Otis Briggs, a 30-year veteran with a graying mustache and a face mapped by broken capillaries, looked up from his crossword. "What do we have here, Harlan?" Briggs asked, eyeing the impeccably dressed woman who seemed completely unfazed by the dingy surroundings. "She doesn't look like your usual late-night problem." "Got myself a sovereign citizen," Gage proclaimed loudly, making sure the 3 other officers in the bullpen heard him. "Pulled her over for a busted taillight, refused to ID, handed me a bunch of fake federal mumbo-jumbo wrapped in a wax seal, arrested her for obstruction and forgery." He guided her roughly into holding cell 3, a cage of heavy steel bars with a single uncomfortable wooden bench. He uncuffed her, stepped out, and slammed the barred door with a loud metallic clang. The woman did not rub her wrists. She did not approach the bars. She simply walked to the center of the bench, sat down, crossed her legs, and stared at the analog clock on the far wall. Gage swaggered over to Briggs's desk and tossed the torn, slightly crumpled envelope and the stack of papers onto the worn wood. "Check out this prop. Sealed federal warrant. These people are getting creative." Briggs picked up the torn envelope. His thick fingers ran over the heavy parchment. He frowned. In 3 decades, he had handled countless fake IDs and forged documents, usually printed on cheap paper full of spelling errors and ridiculous pseudo-legal phrasing. This paper felt different. It had weight. It had texture. He held the torn flap up to the harsh fluorescent light. His blood ran cold. Embedded deep within the fibers was a flawless, intricate watermark of the United States Department of Justice seal. "Harlan," Briggs said, his voice losing its casual drawl, "where exactly did she get this?" "I told you. She pulled it out of her jacket, handed it to me like it was the Holy Grail." Gage laughed, walking over to the coffee machine to pour himself a cup of the black sludge. I ripped it open right in front of her. A bead of sweat formed at Briggs's hairline. He carefully extracted the top document. The heavy black ink at the top read, United States District Court, Eastern District of Pennsylvania. Warrant for search, seizure, and arrest. He scanned down the page. The target of the warrant was not a drug den or a mafia hideout. The target listed was the 8th District Precinct, Oakmont County Sheriff's Department. The individual's name for immediate detention included Captain Baron Crow, Officer Gage Harlan, and all on-duty personnel. Jesus Christ, Briggs whispered, the crossword forgotten. Harlan, you tore this open? Yeah, so? Gage took a sip of coffee, grimacing at the bitter taste. It's fake, Otis. It's not fake. A voice echoed from the hallway. Captain Baron Crow stepped out of his office. He was a lean, wiry man with sharp eyes that missed nothing, known in the district as a man who played by his own rules, a man who had built a very comfortable, very unofficial kingdom inside the walls of the 8th Precinct. Crow walked to the desk and snatched the papers from Briggs's trembling hands. As he read, the color drained from his face. The arrogance that usually radiated from him vanished, replaced by sudden, stark terror. Who is she? Crow demanded, turning sharply toward the holding cell. I don't know. She wouldn't give me her ID, Gage protested, finally sensing the shift in the room. The smugness was starting to leak out of him. You idiot, Crow hissed, stepping aggressively into Gage's space. You ignorant, arrogant, colossal idiot. Look at the bottom of the page. Gage leaned in, squinting at the fine print. It listed the executing officer, Special Agent in Charge, Sloan Mercer, DOJ Office of the Inspector General, Anti-Corruption Task Force. Before Gage could process what that meant, the precinct went completely silent. Not a gradual quiet, an instantaneous one. The hum of the air conditioning cut off. The static chatter of the police radios on every belt went dead at the same moment. Hey, my radio just died, Officer Tarek Ellis called from his desk in the corner. Mine too, said another. Otis, check dispatch, Crow barked, panic finally cracking his voice. Briggs turned to the massive array of computer monitors, the precinct's computer-aided dispatch system. He clicked rapidly, but the screens were frozen. Then, in unison, all 4 monitors flickered, went black, and flared back to life with a single static image. The seal of the Department of Justice, rendered in high definition over a solid blue background. A digital progress bar appeared beneath it, filling rapidly from 0 to 100%. Bold white letters flashed across the screen. Network seized under federal warrant. All communications disabled. Do not attempt to reboot. Captain, Briggs stammered, slamming his fingers on the keyboard. We're locked out. The whole system, phones, internet, radios, KAD, they cut us off from the outside world. Crow sprinted to the heavy steel front doors and shoved against the panic bar. It did not budge. He threw his shoulder against it. The electronic magnetic locks, controlled by the precinct's central server, had been engaged. They were trapped inside. The lights overhead flickered wildly, then shut off completely, plunging the station into darkness for 2 terrifying seconds before the dim red emergency backup lights kicked on. The bullpen was bathed in an eerie, bloody glow. In the silence, a sudden jarring noise made every officer jump. The red rotary phone sitting on Captain Crow's desk, the dedicated federal liaison emergency line. It had not rung in years. Crow walked back to his office as if moving through deep water. The phone kept ringing, a harsh mechanical trill that echoed through the brick walls. He picked up the receiver, hand shaking. Crow, he croaked. Captain Baron Crow. A deep resonant voice spoke on the other end, carrying no emotion, only absolute authority. This is Supervisory Deputy Marshal Quentin Hale. You and your precinct are currently surrounded by heavily armed federal agents. We have locked down your network and sealed your building. On what grounds? Crow demanded, trying to find his bravado. You can't lay siege to a local police station. We can, and we have, Hale replied smoothly. Officer Gage Harlan willfully destroyed a sealed federal warrant and unlawfully detained a federal agent. That was the trigger event. You have exactly 2 minutes to lay your weapons on the floor, open the front doors, and surrender. If you do not, we will breach the building, and anyone holding a firearm will be treated as an active threat to a federal official. Do you understand? The line went dead. Crow slowly lowered the phone. He looked out into the bullpen. Gage Harlan stood completely still, face pale, coffee cup shattered on the floor at his feet. In holding cell 3, illuminated by the red emergency lights, Sloan Mercer finally stood. She walked to the bars, wrapped her fingers around the cold steel, and offered Gage a small, chilling smile. The distant, low-frequency hum vibrated through the floorboards before they even heard the engines, the sound of heavy armored diesel vehicles idling in unison. "Crow, what the hell is happening?" Gage demanded, his voice cracking as reality finally broke through. "Who was on the phone?" "Shut up," Crow snapped, mind racing. He looked at the officers in the room. Some had their hands hovering over their holstered weapons. Others were backing away from the windows. "Everybody listen to me. Do exactly as I say. Unbuckle your gun belts. Put them on the floor. Step away from them." "Captain, we can't just disarm," Officer Tarek Ellis protested, eyes wide with fear. "We don't even know what's out there." "I said drop your weapons," Crow roared, the authority echoing off the brick walls. "If you touch your guns, you are going to die. Do it now." Reluctantly, slowly, the officers began unbuckling their heavy belts. The clatter of loaded Glocks, magazines, and batons hitting the linoleum floor was the only sound in the room. Crow unholstered his own weapon, placed it carefully on his desk, and walked out into the bullpen. Outside, the heavy thud of boots hitting pavement could be heard, followed by the metallic clack of high-powered rifles being racked. Bright, piercing white lights suddenly flooded through the high, barred windows, entirely overpowering the dim red emergency lights inside. "Captain, the doors are electronically locked," Briggs pointed out, hands raised as if the people outside could already see him. "I can't open them." "They'll open them," Crow muttered darkly. How was right? A sudden deafening boom shook the very foundation of the building. The heavy steel double doors at the front entrance buckled inward violently. A second boom followed instantly, ripping the magnetic locks right off the door frames. The doors flew open, crashing against the brick walls. Through the cloud of plaster dust and the blinding glare of tactical lights, they poured in. They were not local SWAT. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized precision that only came from elite federal training. Men and women clad in heavy olive-drab tactical gear, Kevlar helmets, and ballistic plates. Emblazoned across their chests and backs in bold yellow letters were the words U.S. Marshals. At least 20 of them flooded the small lobby and the bullpen. M4 carbines raised and leveled at every officer in the room. Red laser sights danced across Crow's chest, across Briggs' face, and settled directly onto the center of Gage Harlan's forehead. "Hands in the air! Interlock your fingers behind your heads! Do it now!" A voice boomed over a megaphone. Every cop in the room complied instantly, dropping to their knees, fingers laced tightly behind their heads. Through the wall of armed marshals stepped a massive figure. Supervisory Deputy Marshal Quentin Hale looked as if he had been carved from granite. He wore a heavy tactical vest over a suit shirt, a gold badge hanging heavily from a chain around his neck. His eyes swept the room, cataloging everything in a fraction of a second before settling on the torn documents sitting on Briggs's desk. Hale walked forward with slow, deliberate steps. The room was dead silent, except for the heavy breathing of the terrified police officers. He reached the desk, pulled a pair of black nitrile gloves from his pocket, and snapped them onto his massive hands. Carefully, almost reverently, he picked up the torn, wax-sealed envelope and the crumpled federal warrant. He held them up. "Who?" Hale asked, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that commanded the entire room. "Destroyed this document?" Nobody spoke. Crow kept his eyes fixed on the floor. "I won't ask twice," Hale warned, sliding the torn pieces into a clear plastic evidence bag. Sloan Mercer's voice cut through the silence like a scalpel. "It was Officer Gage Harlan, Marshal Hale. He's the one kneeling by the coffee machine." Hale's gaze snapped to Gage. The red laser sights from 3 different rifles immediately centered on his chest. Gage swallowed hard, throat dry. "Listen to me," he stammered, words tumbling out in a desperate rush. She wouldn't ID herself. She handed me this thick envelope with red wax on it. In the middle of the night, people hand us fake sovereign citizen papers all the time to get out of tickets. I didn't know it was real. It was a mistake. Hale took 3 heavy steps toward Gage, towering over the kneeling officer. "A mistake," he repeated softly. Officer Harlan, you executed a traffic stop on a vehicle that was deliberately planted in your patrol sector. You were handed a document sealed by a federal judge. Instead of following protocol, your arrogance led you to destroy federal property and unlawfully arrest an undercover federal agent. But here is the most important part. Officer Harlan. Hale leaned down, face inches from Gage's sweating forehead. We didn't come here tonight because you tore up a piece of paper. We came here because you, Captain Crow, and half the officers in this building have been running an extortion racket on Route 9 for the last 4 years, shaking down commercial truckers, falsifying evidence, and laundering the money through a shell company in Delaware. Gage's eyes widened in sheer panic. He looked over at Crow, who was staring blankly at the floor, totally defeated. Agent Mercer has been auditing your precinct's financial records for 6 months. Hale continued, straightening up. We had enough for an indictment, but we needed to prove absolute willful corruption and a complete disregard for the law to ensure the RICO charges would stick. So, we set a trap. We sent Agent Mercer into your sector with a sealed federal warrant authorizing our raid. Hale gestured to the holding cell. 2 marshals immediately moved forward, producing a set of heavy keys they had taken from Briggs, and unlocked the barred door. Sloan Mercer stepped out. She dusted off her charcoal blazer, completely unfazed by the sea of tactical gear and weapons. She walked over to Gage and looked down at him with the same cold, unyielding gaze she had given him on the side of the highway. I told you, Sloan said quietly, her voice echoing in the dead, silent precinct. You had no idea what you had just initiated. You set me up, Gage whispered, voice trembling with a mixture of rage and terror. You manipulated me into tearing it. I simply handed you an envelope, she replied, her tone clinical and detached. Your ego did the rest. You couldn't stand the idea that someone you pulled over might have authority over you. You couldn't resist showing off your power. And because of that, you added obstruction of a federal investigation to a list of charges that guarantees you will never see the outside of a federal penitentiary. She turned away from him, looking at Hale. Marshal, the precinct is secure. You have the floor. Hale nodded. He turned to the room of kneeling police officers, raising his voice to ensure every word was recorded by the marshal's body cameras. Captain Baron Crow, Officer Gage Harlan, and all individuals named in the warrant, you are hereby placed under federal arrest for racketeering, extortion, wire fraud, and the destruction of federal evidence. You are no longer law enforcement officers. You are federal inmates. Marshals cuffed them all. The chaotic sound of zip ties being ratcheted tight and metal handcuffs clicking shut filled the room. Gage Harlan was hauled roughly to his feet by 2 marshals, his arms twisted painfully behind his back, the exact same way he had handled Sloan Mercer not long before. As he was marched toward the blown-out front doors of his own precinct, he looked back. The station was swarming with federal agents systematically tearing through desks, pulling hard drives, and securing evidence. In the center of it all stood Sloan Mercer, calmly reviewing a tablet, the torn, wax-sealed envelope safely secured in an evidence bag on the desk beside her. Gage realized then the absolute truth. It had never been a traffic stop. It had been an execution, and he had tied the noose himself. The interrogation room at the Philadelphia FBI field office was a sensory deprivation chamber compared to the chaotic grime of the 8th precinct. The walls were soundproofed, painted a stark, unforgiving white. The stainless steel table bolted to the floor was freezing to the touch. Gage Harlan sat handcuffed to a heavy metal ring embedded in the table's surface, staring at the mirrored glass. The swagger he had worn on Route 9 had completely evaporated, replaced by the pungent, unmistakable scent of a man who realized his life was over. The heavy steel door clicked and swung open. Sloan Mercer walked in carrying a thick manila folder. She was no longer wearing the charcoal blazer. She had changed into a dark tactical sweater and slacks, a holstered Sig Sauer resting on her hip. She sat across from Gage and dropped the folder onto the metal table with a dull thud. For 3 agonizing minutes, she said absolutely nothing. She simply watched him. "I want a lawyer," Gage croaked, voice raw. "You already have one," Sloan replied smoothly. "A federal public defender named Elias Vargas. He's currently reading the 34-page indictment we drafted against you. He advised you to remain silent, but I think you and I both know that remaining silent only benefits the men higher up the ladder, men who are currently scrambling to figure out how to cut you loose." Gage swallowed hard, eyes darting to the folder. I didn't know about any racket. I just wrote tickets. Crow told me where to patrol. Sloan opened the folder. She slid an 8x10 glossy photograph across the table. It showed Gage out of uniform, standing in the shadowy loading bay of a warehouse in South Philly, accepting a thick brown paper bag from a man in a greasy mechanic's jacket. You accepted $12,000 in cash from a driver employed by Keystone Logistics, she said, her tone conversational, but razor sharp. A week later, you deposited $4,000 into your personal checking account. The other $8,000 went into a shell company registered in Delaware, managed by Captain Crow's brother-in-law. Gage's breath hitched. He stared at the photograph, mind desperately spinning for an alibi that did not exist. We have the bank records, Gage. We have the wiretaps. Sloan leaned forward. We have dashboard camera footage of you routinely pulling over commercial freight trucks, disabling your body camera, and conducting illegal searches until the drivers agreed to pay civil forfeiture fees on the spot to avoid having their cargo impounded. Crow made us do it, Gage whispered, the betrayal spilling out of him. He said if we didn't play ball, he'd have us transferred to the worst beats in the city, put us in the crosshairs of the local gangs without backup. Captain Crow is currently sitting in a room exactly like this one, 3 doors down, Sloan said, tapping her finger on the metal table. Supervisory Marshal Hale is speaking with him. But here is the problem, Gage. Crow isn't talking. He is terrified, and he isn't terrified of us. Gage looked up, a genuine flicker of fear in his eyes. Your captain is a greedy man, but he isn't a mastermind, Sloan said softly. A precinct captain doesn't have the political cover to run a multi-million-dollar extortion ring on a major interstate highway for 4 years without someone at the courthouse looking the other way. Crow is kicking money up, and whoever he's kicking it to is the person who will ensure Crow has a fatal accident before he ever sees a trial. Gage began to shake. If I tell you who it is, they'll kill me too. If you don't tell me, Sloan replied, eyes narrowing, I will personally ensure you are placed in the general population of the United States Penitentiary in Lewisburg, wearing a jacket that labels you a dirty cop who stole from the cartel's transport lines. You won't last a week. Gage stared at her, realizing she wasn't bluffing. She was offering him a lifeline, but it was wrapped in barbed wire. It wasn't just cash, he confessed, voice breaking. Crow! He kept an insurance policy. He knew the guy at the top would eventually burn him. He kept a ledger. He hid it. Where? Sloan demanded. I don't know the exact location, Gage pleaded, tears welling in his eyes. But Briggs does, the desk sergeant. Briggs was the bagman. He made the deposits. He knows where the ledger is. Sloan closed the folder, her face an unreadable mask. If you're lying to me, Gage, tearing up that warrant will be the least of your problems. At the 8th District Precinct, the chaotic aftermath of the raid had settled into a meticulous, surgical dismantling of the building. Federal forensic accountants and evidence response teams swarmed the bullpen, cataloging every piece of paper, bagging hard drives, and ripping open locked filing cabinets with crowbars. Agent Felix Lang, a bespectacled veteran of the DOJ's Financial Crimes Unit, was meticulously examining the underside of Desk Sergeant Otis Briggs's massive wooden desk. Following the tip Sloan had relayed from Gage's interrogation, Long ran his hands along the heavy oak panels. Got something, Lang called out. Sloan stepped through the ruined front doors of the precinct, the morning sun casting long, harsh shadows across the debris. She walked over to Lang, who was using a pry bar to pop a false wooden panel off the back of the central desk drawer. Inside the hollowed-out cavity was a vacuum-sealed plastic bag. Long carefully extracted it, slicing the plastic open with a pocket knife. Inside was a small black leather-bound notebook and a brass safety deposit box key. Engraved on the head of the key was a 4-digit number and the logo for Liberty Trust Financial. Bingo, Lang muttered, flipping through the notebook. His eyes widened behind his glasses as he scanned the handwritten columns. Agent Mercer, you're going to want to see this. It's not just the trucker extortion money. Sloan took the book. The pages were filled with dates, badge numbers, and monetary figures. But in the margins, there were names, prominent names. City council members, local business magnates, and civil court judges. Crow wasn't just running a toll booth, Sloan said, her voice dropping as the true scale of the corruption dawned on her. He was running a massive intelligence-gathering operation. Whenever his boys pulled over someone high-profile, a judge with a DUI, a politician with a prostitute, a CEO with a trunk full of cocaine, they didn't arrest them. They took the evidence, buried the police report, and added them to the payroll. Blackmail, Lang concluded. Crow was collecting leverage and using it to buy political immunity, Sloan said, staring at a specific name circled in red ink on the final page of the ledger. VL, $50,000 monthly. Who is VL? Lang asked. Sloan looked up, expression grim. Victor Langford, the district attorney. The implications hit the room like a physical blow. If the district attorney sat at the top of the pyramid, then the entire local justice system was compromised. Every warrant issued, every case dismissed, every conviction secured in the last 4 years was suddenly suspect. Sloan pulled out her encrypted cell phone and dialed Marshall Hale. "Quentin," she said the moment he answered. "Put Crow in solitary immediately. Do not let any local corrections officers near him. The umbrella covers the DA's office. Victor Langford is the kingpin." "Understood." Hale's deep voice crackled through the receiver. "But we have a problem, Sloan. Briggs just lawyered up. And guess who walked through the doors of the field office to represent him?" "Don't tell me." Sloan gritted her teeth. "Preston Vale, Langford's personal defense attorney and the city's premier fixer," Hale confirmed. "Word is already out on the street that the precinct fell. Langford knows we have Crow, and he knows we're tearing the station apart. He's making moves to silence the weak links. We need to get to that safety deposit box at Liberty Trust before Langford's people empty it," Sloan ordered. "If Crow kept the ledger here, the hard evidence, the photos, the dash cam footage used for the blackmail, is in that vault. Get a federal judge to sign a seizure order right now. Bypass the local courts completely." 30 minutes later, 3 black SUVs screeched to a halt outside the towering glass facade of Liberty Trust Financial in downtown Philadelphia. Sloan, flanked by heavily armed marshals, strode through the revolving doors, flashing her gold badge at the terrified bank manager. "Federal warrant," she announced, slapping the paperwork onto the marble counter. "We need access to the private vaults, now." The manager, trembling, led them down to the subterranean vault. As they approached the heavy steel gate, Sloan noticed something that made her blood run cold. The security guard stationed outside the vault was lying slumped over his desk, unconscious. "Weapons free," she ordered softly, drawing her Sig Sauer. They moved with lethal precision, slicing the corners of the vault room. At the far end of the narrow aisle of safety deposit boxes, a man in a sharp gray suit was desperately shoving manila folders and USB drives from an open box into a black duffel bag. "Federal agents, drop the bag and put your hands on your head," Sloan shouted, weapon locked onto the center of his back. The man froze. Slowly, he dropped the duffel bag. As he turned around, Sloan recognized him instantly. It wasn't a cartel hitman or a street thug. It was Assistant District Attorney Pierce Holt, Victor Langford's right-hand man. The arrest of Pierce Holt inside the bank vault sent shockwaves through the city's political elite. But Sloan knew it wasn't enough. Holt was a loyal soldier. He would fall on his sword to protect DA Victor Langford. They had the blackmail material. They had the ledger. They had the dirty cops. But connecting it directly to Langford in a court of law required a confession from the inner circle, and Langford was aggressively covering his tracks. Inside the federal holding facility, the tension was suffocating. Baron Crow sat in an isolation cell, pacing like a caged animal. He knew Langford's reach. He knew that even federal walls weren't entirely impenetrable when millions of dollars and a political empire were on the line. A guard pushed a food tray through the metal slot of Crow's door. The guard wasn't one of the usual federal deputies. He was a local county corrections officer temporarily contracted to help with the sudden influx of federal detainees. His name tag read C.O. Reed Finley. Crow looked at the tray. Meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and a small carton of milk. He was starving, but a primal survival instinct screamed at him to stop. He looked up at the small security camera mounted in the corner of his cell. It was equipped with a tiny red light to indicate it was recording. The red light was off. Crow backed away from the tray, heart hammering against his ribs. He looked at the door. Through the narrow, reinforced glass window, Officer Finley was lingering, watching him intently, waiting for him to eat. Suddenly, the heavy steel door of the cell block slammed open. Marshal Hale, moving with terrifying speed for a man of his size, grabbed Officer Finley by the back of his uniform collar and hurled him violently against the cinder block wall. "Don't move a muscle!" Hale roared, pinning the corrupt guard to the wall, while two other marshals secured Finley's wrists. Sloan stepped into the cell block holding a tablet. She walked up to Crow's cell and looked at the food tray. "Agent Mercer!" Crow gasped, pressing his face against the glass. "He was trying to kill me." "We know," she said coldly. "We've been monitoring Finley's bank accounts. 10 minutes ago, a wire transfer of $50,000 cleared into an offshore account in his wife's name. The IP address that authorized the transfer originated from a private server in District Attorney Victor Langford's basement." She unlocked the cell door and stepped inside. "Langford just tried to murder you inside a federal facility." "Crow," she said, staring him down. "He thinks you're a liability. He's not trying to bail you out. He's trying to put you in the ground. Now, are you going to keep protecting the man who ordered your execution, or are you going to help me tear his life apart?" Crow looked at the tainted food tray, then at the corrupted guard being dragged away in handcuffs. The last shred of his loyalty to the syndicate vanished, replaced by a cold, consuming desire for revenge. "What do you need me to do?" he asked, voice dead. Sloan smiled. It was a terrifying, predatory expression. "I need you to make a phone call." An hour later, in a secure communications room, Crow sat with a headset strapped over his ears. Sloan stood behind him, signaling the federal tech team to begin tracing the call. They weren't calling Langford directly. That would spook him. They were calling the DA's private burner phone, a number Crow had memorized for absolute emergencies. The line rang 3 times before a smooth, cultured voice answered. "I told you never to call this number." "Bill, it's Crow," the disgraced captain said, voice trembling slightly, a genuine fear that sold the performance perfectly. "I need help. The feds have me in isolation, but I've got a guard in my pocket who's letting me use a contraband phone." There was a long pause on the other end. "Crow, I heard you were compromised. I heard you lost the ledger." "I didn't lose anything," Crow lied smoothly, reading off a script Sloan had placed in front of him. "The feds hit the bank, but Holt is an idiot. He grabbed the decoy bag. The real hard drives, the ones with the mayor's photos and your offshore routing numbers. I buried them in a lockbox at the shipyard, but I'm not giving them up until you guarantee my family's safety and get me a lawyer who isn't going to sell me out." Another agonizing pause. Sloan held her breath, watching the tracing software on the monitor lock onto a cell tower in the wealthy suburbs of the main line. "Where is the lockbox, Baron?" Langford asked, his tone shifting from dismissive to desperate. "Pier 42, container number 8804. The code to the padlock is your birth year," Crow said. "You have until the end of the night to get my family out of the city, or I give the location to Agent Mercer." Crow hung up the phone. Sloan clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Good work." She turned to Hale. "Langford won't send a lackey this time. He can't trust anyone else. If those drives exist, they have enough evidence to put him away for life. He's going to go to the shipyard himself to destroy them." Hale racked the slide of his M4 rifle, a grim smile spreading across his face. "Let's go catch a district attorney." The trap was set. The hunter who had preyed on the city for years was about to walk blindly into a federal snare, completely unaware that the bait had been laid by the very woman whose legal authority his dirty cops had so arrogantly ripped apart. The fog rolling off the Delaware River was thick and pungent, carrying the scent of brackish water, diesel exhaust, and decaying iron. Pier 42 was a graveyard of rusted shipping containers stacked 5 high, creating a labyrinth of narrow, shadowy canyons. It was completely silent save for the distant, rhythmic clanging of a buoy in the channel. Hidden among the towering metal corridors, 30 heavily armed federal agents waited in absolute stillness. Sloan Mercer crouched behind a stack of wooden pallets, the cold moisture of the fog settling on her tactical gear. Beside her, Supervisory Marshal Quentin Hale watched the entrance to the pier through the green tint of his thermal optics. "Vehicle approaching," Hale murmured, voice barely a breath over the encrypted radio channel. "No headlights." A nondescript dark gray Ford Taurus crept onto the gravel lot. It bypassed the main security gate, which the marshals had deliberately left unlocked, and rolled slowly down the central artery of the shipyard. The car finally eased to a halt in front of a towering stack of blue and rust-colored shipping crates. The driver's side door opened, and District Attorney Victor Langford stepped out into the damp chill. He was a man who practically lived in bespoke Italian suits, accustomed to the pristine air-conditioned environments of courthouses and country clubs. Here, in a trench coat and expensive leather shoes that immediately sank into the muddy gravel, he looked entirely out of his element. But desperation had driven him into the mud. Langford pulled a heavy flashlight from his coat pocket and clicked it on. The beam cut through the fog, sweeping over the painted numbers on the corrugated steel walls. 8802, 88803, 8804. He stopped. He approached the heavy steel doors of container 8804. Welded to the locking bar was an industrial steel lockbox secured by a heavy brass combination padlock. Langford's hands were visibly shaking as he reached out, his breath forming nervous white plumes in the frigid air. He spun the dials of the lock, his birth year. The padlock clicked heavily and popped open. Langford let out a ragged sigh of relief. He threw the padlock to the ground, unlatched the heavy box, and threw the lid open, shining his flashlight inside to claim the hard drives that would secure his freedom. The box was completely empty except for a single crisp piece of heavy parchment paper sealed with the United States Department of Justice emblem. Langford frowned, his heart plummeting into his stomach. He picked up the paper. Printed in bold red ink was a single line of text. Tate USC 015 Destruction of evidence. The exact crime that brought your empire down. Before Langford's mind could fully process the trap, the night erupted. A dozen high-intensity tactical floodlights snapped on simultaneously, instantly vaporizing the shadows and bathing the entire alleyway in a blinding artificial daylight. Langford dropped the paper and threw his hands up to shield his eyes, stumbling backward until his spine slammed against the cold steel of the shipping container. "Victor Langford!" Hale's voice boomed through a megaphone, the sound echoing like thunder off the metal walls. "Keep your hands exactly where they are. You are surrounded by United States Marshals." From every direction, federal agents emerged from the fog. Laser sights cut through the mist, converging on Langford's chest in a dozen tight red dots. Sloan Mercer stepped out from the glare of the floodlights, walking calmly toward the terrified district attorney. Langford squinted, trying to regain a shred of the imperious authority he had wielded for a decade. "Do you have any idea who I am?" he shouted, voice cracking. "I am the district attorney of this county. You are conducting an illegal ambush. I will have every single one of your badges for this. I will bury you in federal court." "You aren't going to court as a lawyer anymore, Mr. Langford," Sloan said smoothly, stopping 5 feet away from him. "You're going as a defendant." "On what grounds?" Langford spat, trying to smooth his trench coat. "You have nothing. A fabricated phone call from a disgraced, corrupt police captain. That is entrapment. It will be thrown out by the first judge who looks at it." Sloan reached into her jacket and pulled out a digital audio recorder. She pressed play. The crisp, clear audio of Officer Reed Finley's interrogation filled the quiet shipyard. "He told me to do it. Langford's guy wired the 50 grand to my wife's account in the Caymans. They said if Crow ate the tray, my family would be set for life. I just had to make sure the cameras were off." Langford's face drained of color. The arrogant sneer vanished, replaced by the hollow, sunken look of a man watching his own execution. "We didn't just trap you with a phone call, Victor," Sloan explained, her tone devoid of any sympathy. "We used the call to force you into motion, to confirm you believe the blackmail evidence existed. But the real crime was the attempted murder of a federal witness inside a federal facility. We seized the IP logs from your home server earlier. We have the wire transfers. We have the corrupt guard." Langford stared at her, chest heaving. The realization that he had been completely outmaneuvered paralyzed him. He looked around at the wall of tactical gear, the relentless glare of the lights, and the unwavering cold eyes of Agent Mercer. "I can give you the mayor," he whispered desperately, his voice dropping to a pathetic bargaining plea. "I can give you 3 state senators. I have records. I have offshore accounts they used. Give me immunity, and I'll hand you the entire state." "The Department of Justice does not cut deals with the cartel boss to catch the street dealers," Sloan replied coldly. "Marshal Hale, take this man into custody." Two marshals stepped forward, violently spinning the district attorney around and slamming him face first into the rusted side of the shipping container. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs echoing in the damp night was the sound of a political dynasty shattering into a million irreparable pieces. Across the city, in the deepest, darkest sub-detention center, Officer Gage Harlan sat alone in his stark white cell. He lay on his thin mattress, staring at the concrete ceiling. The distant rumble of cell doors opening and closing echoed down the block. Suddenly, a guard walked past his cell carrying a portable radio. The local news broadcast was playing through the tiny speaker. Breaking news out of downtown Philadelphia. In an unprecedented sweep, District Attorney Victor Langford has been arrested by federal marshals in a raid at the Delaware River waterfront. This comes mere hours after the stunning federal takeover of the 8th District Precinct. DOJ spokespersons indicate a massive RICO indictment has been unsealed. Gage sat up slowly, hands trembling. The scope of the devastation finally sank in. A multi-million-dollar extortion ring, a network of blackmail involving the city's highest officials, a corrupt empire that had operated flawlessly in the shadows for nearly a decade, and it had all been completely destroyed, violently unraveled in a single night, for one incredibly stupid reason. Because Gage Harlan had to prove he was the biggest man on a dark stretch of Route 9, because his ego couldn't handle a quiet woman in a rusted Honda telling him no. He buried his face in his hands, the cold reality of a 30-year federal sentence crushing the remaining breath from his lungs. In the quiet darkness of his cell, the only sound he could hear echoing in his mind was the sharp, sickening sound of thick paper tearing in half. What started as a routine, ego-driven traffic stop became the match that burned a massive political corruption syndicate to the ground. A single act of arrogance, the tearing of a sealed federal warrant, proved that even the most deeply entrenched criminal empires can be undone by the sheer hubris of their lowest soldiers. Justice isn't always delivered in a courtroom. Sometimes it arrives in a rusty Honda Civic. If you were captivated by this intense real-life tale of corruption, betrayal, and the ultimate federal takedown, please hit that like button, share this story with your friends who love true crime drama, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more incredible deep dive narratives. Stay vigilant, and we'll see you in the next one.